show, right? I think. If I fall asleep first, it's because of the heavy lunch I had. Well, anyway, welcome. My name is John Redgard. I'm the current chairman of the 1805 Club, and I'm mentioning this because this is the fourth McMullen that our club has sponsored a panel. And I want to thank Dr. Evan Wilson for being the individual who brought this motley crew together for this panel. Just a little bit. This is a sales pitch, obviously. We have several 1805 Club members here, which is something to say. The club is in its 31st year, and the modus operandi for the club is a society for academics and enthusiasts of the Georgian era sailing world. Okay, the Georgian era, 1714 through 1837, with the ascension of Queen Victoria. And as I mentioned, there's an emphasis on the Royal Navy. Look at the name of the club, the 1805. And what is the 1805? Trafalgar. But we're much more than that. That period, the Georgian era sailing world, was very much an exciting time, I know, for us as historians. The age of exploration, scientific advancements, as well as obviously the second series of a global wars, the Anglo-French Wars. Excuse me. And as I mentioned, the club takes its name from the iconic Battle of Trafalgar. Now, our program deals with commemorative events, academic research, sponsoring such panels as what we have here today, as well as artifacts preservation. And we're dealing, as I've mentioned, not just the Royal Navy, but think of the major navies of the world at that time, to include our own nascent United States Navy. So, as I mentioned, there's a bunch of academics and enthusiasts for this period of time, but we also placed that world and what its legacy is today's world, today's maritime world. Now, I'm very happy to have these wonderful people who I've known for quite a while. The theme of this panel is the challenges of operating in a distance. And as Dr. Wilson wrote in his proposal to the McMullen, it's about navies and failure. And as he wrote in his proposal to the McMullen, the paper examines three different varieties of failure: catastrophic, logistical, and operational. And all three papers, as he said, deal with navies, how they grappled with the challenges of operating at a distance. And I think when you think about it and you see what they have to say, there's a lot of contemporary aspects of this, especially if you're dealing with the United States Navy in the Great Pacific Waters. Okay? Now, our first presenter is Dr. Jakob Serup. He is presently on the island of Bornholm in Denmark. And his paper examines the failed Danish naval operation on the Barbary coast in 1753. Believe it or not, the Danes were also involved with the Barbary pirates. Now, Dr. Serup is presently the curator of Bornholm's Museum in Denmark. He received his doctorate from Copenhagen University in 2010, and his dissertation was the organization, manning, and daily life in the Royal Danish Navy in the 18th century. Dr. Serup, you're on. It's a 6-hour difference, I think. 6 hours, isn't it?
Can't hear you.
If you know your geography, Bornholm is just south Sweden in the Baltic.
I would help you with tech support, but my Danish.
Don't ask me.
Jakob, can you hear us? You did.
You can.
Can you hear me now? Oh, what a relief. Right. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you for having me at the Macmillan Symposium, and thank you for to the 1805 Club for sponsoring this. I used to work at the Royal Danish Naval Museum, and I wrote my dissertation on the Danish Navy in the 18th century, and I particularly studied the daily life and culture, but I also during my studies noticed that there were some operations that were quite different from the regular service. Amongst these were the operations at the Barbary coast. Now, this is a challenge that both the Danish and the British and French and even the US navies dealt with. The problem that the good people in North Africa had this terrible habit of taking European sailors hostage and even selling them off as slaves. This was a huge problem in the 15th and 16th century, and even up in the 17th century. But in the 18th century, it wasn't in the same scale as it had been before, but it was still something that had to be dealt with if you wanted to conduct maritime trade in the Mediterranean area. But the Danes found a way of dealing with it in 1746. Basically, we made a deal with the Barbary pirates, as we would have called them at the time, agreeing that we would basically send and provide them with guns and victualling and ammunition and ropes and whatever, so that they wouldn't take Danish sailors, Danish and Norwegian sailors hostage. And I do realize this is problematic. It's sort of you could imagine, for instance, today if the Danish state decided to provide Somali pirates with containers of AK-47s every year, and then they in return would be so kind not to take our sailors hostage. Of course, this was problematic, but nevertheless, it worked, and it worked for 100 years. It was only abandoned in 1846, and the way that it was administered was that the Danish sailors would be provided with a letter, like you can see here, where it stated the name and of the ship and of the captain, and below the wavy line, that was the part that the Danish captain would have on board his ship, and then the Barbary coast pirates were not able to read Danish, of course. But then they would be provided with the top half of the letter that you see here above the wavy line. Then they could sort of put the jigsaw together, and that would, if it would fit, then that meant that this ship was free to pass. So this system worked very well, and in 1750. A Moroccan Jew went to Copenhagen with a proposition that Danish merchants should conduct trade in Morocco. And there was an initial expedition which was quite successful. There were lots of goods to be traded, and a good profit to be made. So the Moroccans then proposed that the Danes should sort of formalize this relation a bit further. And in the Danish government, it was decided that it was worth the effort to establish a trading station in Morocco, in the port of Safi or Safia. And the expedition left Copenhagen in the spring of 1751, sailed north of the British Isles and on the western side, because at the time the British claim on salute and respect in the Channel was disputed, and instead of risking being forced to salute and strike the flag in the Channel itself, the Danish Navy regularly simply sailed the other way around to sort of pass on this problem. So in just a second. Yes, sorry. So the Danish expedition arrived well in Morocco. It was headed by this negotiating committee was headed by a French officer in Danish service, Jean-Baptiste de Carrière de Longueville. Under him, he had 2 frigates and 3 transport vessels and 300 soldiers. And it was initially it all went well. Like the practical side of the expedition, the ships arrived safe, but then some difficult negotiations began, and the Danes had sort of probably become a bit too eager. They said, well, we can establish this fort and a trading station. But then they went on a bit further and said that, well, they would also like to collect toll fees from all ships that visited this port. And the Moroccans sort of understood that this wasn't going anywhere good. So they decided to cut their losses and basically take Longueville and 44 Danes, some soldiers and some sailors who were on shore on that day, and simply hold them for ransom instead. Now, this was not something that the Danes were prepared for, and the Danish ships remained on station at Safia, but it didn't really, nothing really came of it. So they sent letters home and asked, what do we do now? And next year, that's the yellow line you see, there is a rescue mission to resolve this situation. A frigate is sent to reinforce the Danish presence at the Bay of Safia. Now, and this time you'll notice that it sails through the channel because they need to go as quickly as possible to resolve the situation. However, on the way, the ship's captain, Captain Holst, dies, and the ship has to call in the port of Portsmouth, and Holst is now was buried on the Isle of Wight. The ship then called also in both Lisbon and Seville, because the Danish ships that had been on station at Safia couldn't remain there because it was quite rough seas, and they weren't on friendly terms with the Moroccans. So they had sent letters back home to Copenhagen to say that, well, they would meet up with the Danish ships either at Seville or Lisbon, depending on the situation. So they call in Lisbon, and there aren't any Danish ships there, and then they proceed to Seville and meet up with the Danish ships and go on to the Bay of Safia. Now, it doesn't really work out very well, because the authorities in Morocco couldn't quite see a way of meeting the Danish terms. It was now clear for everybody that there was no future in this trading station. It just wasn't going to happen. So they might as well go for as high a ransom as absolutely possible. The Danish ships were not in a position that they didn't have enough guns. They didn't have mortars to shell the port and the city of Safi, and so it was simply too difficult to carry out, to force the release of the Danish hostages. So in the end, they resolved the situation by paying 18,000 styk von Akten to the Moroccans. Now, that could have been the end of it. By the way, this map sort of shows the operation area. You've got you've got Lisbon and Seville in the left-hand side, and then you've got the port of Safia in the very corner, very low right corner here, and this was the area that the Danish ships would go back and forth. So when they needed provisions, they would cross over to Lisbon or Seville, and of course this was expensive, and it was time consuming, and it just wasn't going anywhere. So on the 3rd of June 1753, the situation was at long last resolved. The Danish officers went on shore and basically with barrels of gold to the Moroccans, and the Danish hostages were released, and everybody was happy. And as at the very moment that the the released hostages came on board the flagship, they could see the frigate Falster, that there was a problem, and the smoke was rising from the ship, and in the end, it caught fire. It was an accident. A boy had misstepped and lost the candle he was holding down in the hold. It caught fire, and it went disastrously wrong. The ship was not. It couldn't be saved, and by nighttime, after it had burned for 5 hours, it exploded, and 132 of the crew were killed. And the rest of them swam ashore, and now there was much consideration. Would they now be held hostages again? But the Moroccans did, in the end, release them to the other Danish ships, and so they could return home. Now, this is the results of a book that I wrote and published earlier this year in Danish, and it both tells the story as it happened, with lots of examples of the life on board the ship, and but it also tries to put a bigger perspective on the operation, because on one hand you can see that this is of course a disaster. It is the loss of a frigate, the loss of 132 sailors, the loss of a lot of gold, and also, of course, a loss of prestige and honor. So when you see at first glance, it does appear to be basically a disaster. But then I tried to look at other Danish operations in the same period, and I could see that this was just one example of many where the Navy, which was in an 80-year-long period of prolonged peace between 1720 and 1801, was put to use. The king, the government could see that this was an institution that it was necessary to uphold. It needed to be ready for war, but in the meantime, it could be put to use for this type of daring projects. If you saw commercial potential or even a cultural potential. One Danish naval officer, Niebuhr, was sent to Arabia basically to conduct cultural and natural history studies, collect coffee beans and whatever specimens that he could find, and sent it back to Copenhagen. So this was furthering the scientific status of the university in Copenhagen and of Denmark as such. And in this instance, well, it seen from our position today, it appears to have been a stupid or a foolish project, but that's because we now know that it wasn't going to end well. But at the time, there was a potential. This might have been a good idea if they had gotten along with the Moroccan authorities, but that just didn't work out. So basically, they had to make do with this solution. In the end, Denmark and the Danish king had almost nothing to show for this huge investment of deploying several ships and losing one, and these 132 men at the coast of Morocco. But they returned to Copenhagen with gifts from the Moroccans. They had gifted the Danish king, Sultan Friedrich, as they called him, with some camels and hyenas, and they unfortunately perished with the Falster and the explosion. But the ostriches survived because they were on board another ship, and there were 4 or 5 of these ostriches that made it all the way back to Copenhagen on board this Navy ship, and they were accompanied by a little Moor who, as a young boy, was going to tend to these ostriches. They returned in the fall of 1753. And the ostriches had a nice house built for them next to the royal castle on Frederiksberg. But the poor Moor froze so bitterly in the Danish winter, so he also had an unfortunate accident with fire. So the ostrich stable caught fire, and the 5 ostriches all perished in this fire as well. And all that was left were these ostrich eggs that you can enjoy today if you visit the royal collection at Rosenborg Castle in Copenhagen, because they were turned into beautiful pieces of art by a royal craftsman. And I'm not sure what the Danish king thought when he looked at these ostrich eggs, but they might have been a reminder of a horrible of an expedition that went horribly wrong. But they also reminded him of the endless possibilities in the world that were pursued by the Danish state, and using the Danish Navy as a vessel for that. So that, in short, is my presentation for today, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jakob. The eggs are there. Our next presenter, excuse me, Dr. Corey Convertito.
That's you.
I got it
We
right.
can get into the last name war later.
Well, yeah, try my last name, right? Anyway, in her paper, Equipped for War, Royal Navy supply chain failures to the West Indies in the 1790s. Now, Corey concentrates on the inadequacies in the supply chain from Great Britain to the West Indies during the early stages of the Great Anglo-French War of 1793 to 1815. And I think you will agree with me that her paper provides us with a greater understanding of transportation difficulties, the logistics strain affecting Royal Navy operations during that early part of the Great Anglo-French War. Corey is presently the curator and archivist at the Key West Historical Society in Key West, Florida. She received her doctorate in maritime history from the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom in 2012. Corey, it's all yours.
All right. Come up here, I'm gonna grab the clicker. I'll take this bit out of the way so you can see the slides, hopefully. Okay, so I'm going to talk about being equipped for war and sort of focusing on the Royal Navy supply chains, and mostly because this panel's about failure, and so as you can guess, this doesn't go well. War in the 18th century was really a protracted affair. Communication, lines, and movement of troops and stores were very sluggish. By and large, a range of boards and bureaucratic entities each oversaw one aspect of organization and logistics. Coordinating the shipment of food, stores, medicines, and ordnance from Britain to its colonies was toilsome and customarily carried by merchant vessels that also required several levels of preparation. Supplying British West Indies colonies amplified this laborious process, really the consequence being that naval personnel assigned to these stations were frequently deprived of essential victuals and stores. Nevertheless, as the 18th century advanced, scores of improvements were made to this logistics network, so that by the time of the French Revolution, the British believed that they were in a sounder position to stage these large expeditions to capture these lucrative French West Indies colonies. Overall, they were. However, despite the streamlining that they do, especially post-American Revolution, there remained a significant shortfall in logistics that negatively impacted their operations. Personnel in the West Indies who felt the shortages most closely were very vocal and blessing for this paper about the annoyances they felt, writing to each branch of government detailing the suffering and the extemporary means they had to employ to alleviate the deficiencies on their own. This paper will examine the failures in logistics and the transport system to the West Indies during the French Revolutionary period, paying particular attention to the grievances of the naval personnel serving in the region throughout these joint expeditions. Okay, so even though they did not feature prominently during the entire period of the French Revolution, the islands of the West Indies were vitally important to Britain's war efforts. Military operations were based largely on the European continent, with the islands supplying much needed financial support. Lucrative commodities such as sugar, cotton, tobacco, and coffee were grown on a number of these islands, all of which were transported back to Europe and sold. So that's very important. Indeed, the significant reason for the British presence in the West Indies during that time was largely financial in nature, although its larger strategy involved utilizing its naval power and expeditionary forces to capture French colonial possessions. This, of course, was easier said than done. Britain had experience in global warfare, tangentially dating back to the War of Spanish Succession. But advancements from that time did not come organically to their network or the bureaucratic system. Rather, it took government maneuvering to bring together several of these independent cogs in order for them to work together in concert to improve the system. And it's very difficult to move this far away. So for the next half of the century, Britain gained valuable knowledge in overseas operations. And this is a quote from Roger Morris. Partly he blames it, the effective union with the private sector, and partly the development of an efficient administrative infrastructure. That's from Roger. And Jeremy Black really takes this a step forward, this amalgamation of boards and trying to improve this logistical network. When Jeremy considers the growth and development further, and he categorizes the deliberate blend of assorted military entities when he says, the quote, the powers best able to wage war were those who got close to a synthesis of military organization and political administration, end quote. At the time of the French Revolution, the British had made extraordinary efforts in infrastructure, reorganization in the public and private sector, and they acknowledged that separate boards acting independently only served to hamper the military engine. Maintaining an army and navy across the Atlantic during the American Revolution fueled the reorganization. It's because they had so much difficulty in taking stores to North America during the American Revolution. The Brits they're quite pointed in this reorganization effort after the war. And so they reorganized, and the distribution of food and transports, and they eventually merge out as new boards in the 1793 to 1794 period. Up until that time, the War Office had made all the fiscal decisions on behalf of the Army, while the Admiralty Office represented the needs of the Navy. But then sub-boards existed within both of those structures, meaning that there was a limited central brain actually contending with all of these moving parts. And since the American Revolution, Britain had honed its web-like network of merchant ships and amalgamated boards, so the Army was not competing with the Navy anymore, because of course if you're feeding an Army and you're feeding a Navy, they're both pulling from the same sources, but they're not working in concert with one another. You're really competing against yourself for a lot of it, and that's something that they were trying to do away with. Even with the introduction of these wider focused boards, such as the victualling and transport boards, coordination and communication were very problematic. Often the issues emanated from government, sending orders. I feel like this is resounding what we've heard this morning, where it's like from the top down. The issues are starting at the top. It's emanating from government. They're sending out orders to victual or man overseas garrisons with specific amounts. They're often increasing or decreasing the need at a moment's notice, and these boards just can't keep up with everything that they are ordered to do. Irrespective of the quantities that are dispatched for the joint expeditionary forces, as we'll see, any army overseas, regardless of these expeditions, the armies overseas needed to be replenished all the time. So there had to be a systematic replenishment of officers, men, horses, heavy artillery, weapons, ammunition, clothing, shoes, you name it, they needed it. And so there had to be a systematic, but then also amped up when the expeditions left. Aside from the central boards responsible for food, transportation, and medicines, a further supply of networks also existed, operating in the West Indies dockyards and in and around the dockyard area, specifically of Jamaica and Antigua, and each of them were tasked with organizing the redistribution of these provisions. So it gets to be a very complicated network, and all these the provisions are coming from, some from North America, South America, and England, and so the system has a lot of weaknesses to it, as we can see. But the system, they felt they were pretty primed to make these expeditionary forces happen with all of the restructuring they had done. So, as I said, hence on the eve of the French Revolution, it seemed that British confidence in its supply chain to and in the West Indies was fairly high. The logistical issues from the American Revolution were not to be repeated, or were they? Well, they were. Spoiler alert. So regardless of this tightening up of these administrative channels, there was no evading the fact that the naval stores, victuals, ordnance, and medicines in enormous quantities had to be shipped from Britain or North America and South America, irrespective if war was fought on the continent or its overseas territory. The West Indies islands were unable to produce a sufficient amount of food to maintain its inhabitants. So never mind these expeditions turning up. The West Indies colonies barely can feed and take care of themselves. So they were completely deficient following the arrival of these large military forces. Nearly all of the provisions for the seamen and troops had to be imported and on an ambitious scale. Colonists had to import flour, biscuit, corn, beef, butter, salt, fish, and rice from North America, beef and corn and butter from Ireland, and wine from Madeira. So you're pulling all different resources from all over, and of course you're competing with other private sector as well. In the case of the West Indies, the ship from Britain, transport ships had to travel some 4,000 miles, and it could take up to months to arrive depending on poor weather, and especially longer in the summer hurricane season. And they were susceptible to inclement weather and unseaworthy vessels. So there's a lot of issues with just sending these shipments. It's a very difficult process. Shipments organized by on-island contractors were subject to occasional damage, and they were competing directly with the victualling board as well, which drove up prices. And then the Admiralty doesn't want to pay these prices, so it's a little hairy. And the people that are suffering are people on station. And so sometimes the contractors that are often that are contracted to supply the goods on island are unable to fill their end of their contracts. After all the modifications and these enhancements belonging to this complex logistical system were initiated, why in 1797 was Vice Admiral Parker forced to write from his command on the Jamaica station, detailing the lack of necessaries and the need for he and his men to expend a great deal of money locally to procure what was crucial for his survival. So his squadron, to put it in context, was 9,597, and it was completely saddled with sick men, and they were very short of supplies. He was compelled to purchase molasses and wine and fruit and vegetables and lime juice, amongst other necessaries, since his provisions were in short supply. Parker noted, quote, that the procuring of these articles was difficult and uncertain, both with respect to time as well as quantities, unquote. He goes on further, and I apologize for the large quote, but you can feel the frustration, I think, and not being able to be supplied properly from Britain. He says, quote, I have made it a rule to purchase or cause to be purchased every species of fruit, vegetables, and lime juice, when or wherever they could be procured, and directed that the same be issued to the squadron under the particular charges and directions of their captains and respective surgeons, to be distributed to the ship's companies in quantities as they might judge proper and more conducive to the health of the men in general, in which I am conscious they have done with the greatest success and economy, consistently with the state of health of the crews, as had it not been for the exertions on my part and the attention on the part of the captains and the surgeons, this squadron, had it existed, would have been rendered unfit for any service, each of which has been occasionally supplied and purchased by my order, and though it may perhaps be thought as a heavy expense to the public, was, I felt, my indispensable duty to adopt, end quote. Remarkably, the Admiralty agreed to actually reimburse Parker for all of the expenditures rather than quibble over the cost, because it was an excessive amount that he was asking for and over their normal. But this is something that is replicated, I find, in a lot of the correspondences, or these captains and the surgeons having to procure their own goods because there is nothing forthcoming from Britain. So how had this government's fastidious restructuring led to Parker and his squadron to be so deficient? While lessons had been learned during previous conflicts, the government repeatedly underestimated the task of fitting out and maintaining military forces in its distant colonies. When France declared war on Britain in 1793, the latter's immediate priority was to keep the former out of the Low Countries. However, strategic plans were brought forth by Dundas that involved undermining French power by attacking France where it hurt the most, which is its wallet. France's West Indian colonies generated 2/5 of French foreign trade and 2/3 of its deep sea shipping. Supposing that Britain could capture Martinique, Guadeloupe, St. Lucia, Saint Domingue, it would have disastrous financial implications for France. So Dundas sought to assemble this great expedition. They get this idea, they think they restructured enough that they're capable of sending large forces to the West Indies. And so they want to commute control of those particular colonies to Britain. Dundas has noble intentions when arranging these joint expeditionary forces, ideally allowing adequate preparation time so it would be ready to sail by September. So they come up with this idea in the spring. Dundas wants them to sail in September after the hurricane season, so it's safer for the squadron to do so. Admittedly, he's overloaded on the pressures on his time in the early months of the conflict, and so the preparations that he is determined to make to have this expeditionary force leave on time and fully prepared just go completely out the window. So orders were not even given to the first week of August. They wanted to sail in September. So this is by no means a sufficient amount of time to organize such a large-scale campaign. Notice to the Admiralty came days later for it to prepare and provide shipping for the regiments. An added concern was Dundas had not offered command of the army to General Sir Charles Grey's pictured here until mid-August. They want these people to leave in September, and they're assigning him in mid-August, which is crazy. And this was exceedingly late and was contradictory to Dundas's initial strategies for the outbreak of the war. Vice Admiral Jarvis was made naval commander during this late stage as well. So time was of the essence now. And as a result, Jarvis inundated the Admiralty with requests as he was preparing the squadron at Portsmouth. He wanted wine instead of spirits to preserve the health of his crews. Like, they're being proactive in what they need. They know what the government's going to give them is probably not enough. And so they're being proactive by writing and asking for extras. He wanted lightning conductors. He wanted new fumigating lamps so he could fumigate the ships between decks. Jarvis also insisted on a list of medicines for use of the sick. on board the squadron, and the Admiralty agrees to all his demands, but organizing it's one thing for them to agree that, sure, this is what you can have, but actually physically getting it on board the transport ships and out to the West Indies presents, a separate set of problems. So with Gray and Jarvis confirmed, this frenzied task of military and logistical planning at last began. The cabinet ordered the pulling of troops from various locations, and the intent was to provide Gray with a total strength of a little over 16,000 men. So fast-moving arrangements meant that the ordnance, sick and hurt, and victualling boards needed to mobilize quickly, but this was not always possible. Communication and again, this is another buzzword from this morning, communication difficulties and non-synergetic interactions created confusion and delays. Several crucial elements were the responsibility of the Ordnance Board, and that would be conveyed to the West Indies on the same transports carrying the troops that were arranged by the Transport Board, and they're not really communicating with one another how to accomplish all of this. The coordination proved to be too intricate and the timeline unworkable, especially for the Ordnance Board. They just didn't have enough in stores to put on board these transport ships. Between the barracks and guns and stores that were expanded at Woolwich, the expedition's projected sailing date kept nudging further and further along. The September date was a non-starter, but still, it kept being delayed further and further. Between the need for troops and supplies on the continent and the difficulties in inter-service communication, the relations between the boards, the Admiralty failed to mobilize until the end of November, a full 8 weeks after the projected date, with a reduced force of just over 7,000, nearly half of the troops that Dundas wanted to send out. Regardless of the additional preparation time that they had, so they have these extra 8 weeks, the squadron was still not complete. Jervis and Gray left Britain minus a handful of transport and the hospital ship, and that's really important, and that's something that they immediately start complaining about. So that they leave, they don't have all the transports and they don't have the hospital ship, and the hospital ship is carrying a lot of the medication and supplies that are needed. So this is something Mike Duffy writes a lot about, and he reflects on this planning of this West Indies expedition in 1793 as a sorry story, quote, which might charitably be put down to teething troubles in the first year of the war, but which, when all excuses have been made, was the result of discreditable oversight and want of decision, end quote. Okay, now clear of this bureaucratic labyrinth, Gray and Jarvis crossed the Atlantic, arriving at the West Indies in January 1794. Noticeably absent were two ships that Gray was so desperate to have. One was the hospital ship Roebuck that was held up in Portsmouth. Not only was its purpose to be the hospital ship, it was, like I said, also charged with carrying the majority of the expedition's medical supplies. Second was the Peggy transport that departed Cork that carried comparable supplies as well. So the two things they really need them, I mean, aside from food, they need these medications because these men are getting, dropping as soon as they're arriving in the West Indies. So the failure to arrive within days of the squadron was detrimental to the troops. Scurvy and typhus ravaged the men. Gray's sick list approached 12,000 in a list that would swell to nearly 2,000 men at any point during the operation. And Jervis and Gray beseeched the local population to provide whatever fresh food and medical supplies it could in the absence of the Roebuck and the Peggy. And requests by Gray were dispatched to Dundas pleading for these items to be sent at once, particularly hospital ships, in order to prevent future outbreaks of sickness. So local forces already were sick by the time they got there too, so they were really of no help because they were in Saint-Domingue already, and most of the troops there. So they arrived to, there's no supplies when they get there, so they're lacking things, and there's actually a deficit when they arrive as well. And so, and the contractors can't keep up what's happening already, so it just becomes a bigger and bigger problem, and there's more obstacles than resolutions. So notwithstanding the lack of additional promised men and supplies, the expedition secured nearly all of its strategic objectives in a single campaign. And so this is when people really focus on, historians look at this time period, they see the British actually accomplishing a lot when they get there, although they're very short of supplies. So the British took Martinique in March of 1794, followed by St. Lucia the same month, and Guadeloupe capitulated in April. An offensive was attempted on the Isle of Saint-Domingue, and after a promising start and then kind of a non-movement in the sickly season, it didn't go much further than that. But reinforcements had been promised by Dundas. They wanted to reinforce the West Indies, to augment the expeditionary forces that had sent out, but they were all redirected to the continent. And the big problem is the communication lines. How long is it taking for word from London to get to the West Indies to find out that you're not getting the reinforcements that you're so desperate for and the supplies that you need? So it's very difficult for these people to make these decisions on the ground, not knowing what's happening elsewhere. And during this time, more and more people are getting sick. There's scarcity in items. There's commander-in-chief of the Jamaica station is writing constantly to the sick and hurt board, asking for more and more medical supplies and fresh provisions, all of which were not coming. The Rear Admiral Ford, who was in Jamaica at the time, actually writes to the sick and hurt board and says there's so many men struck down with yellow fever that they were relapsing because of the lack of food. They were getting better, but because there was nothing to sustain them, they were actually starting to drop off again daily. And Jarvis as well writes to the sick and hurt board several times, asking for medical supplies, asking for soup to be dispatched immediately, a request that was ultimately fulfilled, but only by request. Like they're not proactively sending out supplies to the West Indies. It's certainly something they're having to write and go, okay, sure, we'll send that. As the sickly summer season approached, Gray and Jervis were caught off guard, which I think, you're not talking about that today, are you? No, you're later. And so, the French turn up unexpectedly, and the British have nothing. They're short of supplies. Gray actually complains that no supplies have been conveyed since his arrival, so back in January. And he and his men were lacking basic items such as shoes and clothing. Never mind food; they don't have any shoes and clothes, let alone medicine and victuals. There was no additional manpower, nor was Dundas willing to send ships to the tropics or supplies during the unhealthy season, despite repeated requests from Gray. Men and materials were in short supply everywhere, and the troops that were feasibly available for these new recruits were unseasoned. And rather than risk the lives of new recruits, Dundas opted to postpone transportation until later in the year and stay out of the sickly season. But this doesn't get communicated effectively to those on the ground in the colonies. So there is a plan to replenish eventually. So Rear Admiral William Parker is assigned to a convoy that's preparing at Portsmouth and Plymouth that Dundas had intended to relieve and replenish Gray and Jervis in the autumn of 1794. But Gray and Jervis actually get back to Britain before the resupplies leave England. It's incredible that they can't get these supplies out. And so, they're writing to the Admiralty. They need medicines, everything. Same story, different expedition. So there's a lot of delays. They don't actually leave until February, which is months later. So Dundas acknowledges these many logistical failings felt by the Gray Jervis expedition and the under-equipped Parker convoy that ended up going to Jamaica, although months late and after the original expedition had come back. And so he was bound and determined not to repeat these failures during the planning for the next expedition in 1795. He tells the transport board in July that they need to find shipping for about 25 to 35,000 men and enough stores to go to the West Indies. So again, these various boards are tapped to provide ordnance and provisions, etc. Abercrombie has chosen to lead the troops, and more illuminating, and I think this is very telling that they're aware of their logistical failings. Partially, they picked Hugh Christian to lead, to be the leader for the Navy, who, because he was on the transport board. So you're picking him. He understands the logistical network. I think that plays into there's a lot of other things that why he's chosen. But he has an intimate working knowledge of the other boards. He has decent relationships. He knows some of the contractors. And so even though Dundas was adamant that the logistical failures on the previous expeditions would not be repeated, and the government vowed to put its weight behind properly equipping Abercrombie and Christian, the undertaking was again grossly underestimated. Transport ships were difficult to come by. Transport board clamored to secure East and West Indiamen, among others. Ordnance was terribly behind. This is just a repeated cycle of the expedition before, but they fooled themselves into thinking that they've got it down pat for the next expedition, which isn't the case. And just to give you an idea of how much food they're sending out, feeding the expeditionary force and conveying this enormous number of provisions for troops. So they had to bring supplies for the next expedition, but they're also having to bring enough to sustain the troops that were left in the West Indies on the garrisons as well. So food shortages, et cetera, really play into this. And so this is what they want to carry, but they're having a really difficult time finding it anywhere. And let's see, I'll skip ahead a little bit. And again, they need 100,000 tons of shipping to make this happen during this expedition. And the Transport Board is really only able to secure 60 to 70,000 tons of shipping to bring this material. And they don't have the material to really do it. So faced with these food shortages, shipping deficiency, rushed ordnance, damaged vessels, treacherous weather conditions, and troops concerned with the duties that lay ahead, it is perhaps unsurprising that when this expedition's departure is delayed until mid-February, it's supposed to leave much earlier, although many of the transports and store ships suffered further postponements and were not actually dispatched until March. So Abercrombie and Christian do go out and they stage these successful attacks on St. Lucia and St. Vincent and Grenada. And again, I think that's been a lot of the focus of these successes against the French colonies. But the protracted delays from the supply chain breakdowns across several departments meant that the troops had little time for occupations before the onset of the sickly season. Abercrombie returned to Britain with a few victories, but had failed to carry out most of the main objectives. The last thing I kind of want to look at is the last expedition that will kind of focus in this time period. And so Vice Admiral Hyde Parker, who I love because he writes more letters than anyone else I can find. So there's a lot of material, and he's very angry about everything all the time. So it's good fodder. So he's an astute administrator, and he takes these frequent occasions to write to anyone and everyone in the Admiralty and the Sick and Hurt Board and the Victualling Board to express his complaints about the lack of supplies that are being delivered to the West Indies. This persistent letter writing eventually begat permission for Parker to start procuring his own items, such as fresh fruits and citrus from local vendors. But he was given a price cap on that. But I mean, the understanding is they cannot supply what he needs, and so he's able to, if he can find it at a reasonable cost, to get it himself rather than waiting, and these items don't turn up. Similar dispensations were also made for Rear Admiral Henry Harvey, who was commander of the Leeward Island Station. This was not business as usual, but the difficulties felt across the islands meant that the Admiralty had to ease its operational procedures in order to keep men well enough to arm the ships and the troops to sustain the garrisons. And even in this twist, I guess to kind of give you an idea of like the global shortages and what they were facing, the Admiralty actually writes to Harvey a few times asking him to procure items for the continent. They need lime juice because scurvy is running rampant and they can't find any in the Mediterranean. So they're asking him to procure it in the West Indies and actually have it shipped back because that's how terrible the supply chain was. So there's another expedition in 1795 and 6, and the government was eager to overarm, blah, blah, blah. And they considered the need for medical stores in quantities that were conveyed, but they were insufficient to treat the mounting number of sick and wounded on board these naval ships and the hospitals. And so it sort of shifts now. There's a surgeon of the fleet, and all the medicals are starting to write, saying that everything is they're having to purchase it and they're getting reimbursed. Where 20 years ago, when these surgeons were doing the same thing, they were constantly denied. And all these letters that are going back to the Victualling Board and Sick and Hurt Board, they're using their own money and they're getting it reimbursed. I think again that's that acknowledgement of how bad this supply chain is. So I'll just skip really to the conclusion because this is like the same record going over and over again with what happened. No, it's absolutely true. And then Trinidad, but then the Spanish jump in and same thing. The Spanish have nothing either, and actually it gets worse after that because several of the supplies that were the fresh cattle was coming from Central and South America and were being supplied by the Spanish. But as soon as the Spanish jump in, that supply chain runs out, so they have less, they have less availability of those fresh supplies. So, in conclusion, this was an utter failure. No, It's not. So I mean, you know, the English, the British are able to accomplish a lot. They set out these objectives and they're able to accomplish them. You know, they get Martinique, they get Guadeloupe, you know, they do make some inroads in Saint-Domingue, and eventually that comes to fruition. Other islands, they capture Trinidad. But looking at the logistical failures, I mean, it's very hard, I think, to sustain these troops, these officers and troops and seamen that were transported. I mean, it was over like 61,000 troops were transported, and seamen were transported from Europe to the West Indies between July of 1793 to June of 1797, alongside the appropriate, you know, amount of supplies and provisions. You know, they're using these transport ships, and I mean, it's a big job. And I think they grossly underestimate what they're capable of. I think that by that restructuring that happens right after the American Revolution, they completely underestimate the job ahead of them, and they're very ambitious. They think they can fight this global war because they're not just focused on the West Indies. You know, they're also focused on the continent and the East Indies, and they're so ambitious, and they just don't have you know, the structure in place and the supply chains in place to allow the things that they want to happen to come to fruition. So you know, it was tough. It's a tough job. It's a thankless job, but I think, you know, the British just weren't ready for it. But in the end, they do get a lot of what they want. But it was a really hard road to get there.
Thank you, Corey. Our next presenter, Dr. Ken Johnson, is his title is Occupying the English and Unforeseen Points: Napoleon's Struggle for Maritime Power Projection, 1804 to 1810, and highlights how Napoleon sought to use his navy to threaten Britain's global empire. But his plans, his naval operational execution in the Caribbean and Indian Ocean were hampered by significant logistical limitations, shifting alliances, and unstable finances. Dr. Johnson is currently the research coordinator at the U.S. Air Force's Air University, and he holds his doctorate from Florida State University in 2006. Ken, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. So during the Anglo-French War of 1804 to 1814, the United Kingdom and its navy continued to challenge Napoleon Bonaparte's ambitious plans, particularly at sea. Although Napoleon understood sea power better than he is often given credit for, particularly during the later years of his empire, he struggled to develop effective naval campaigns against England. While gaps in Napoleon's knowledge of naval affairs, particularly early on in his reign, were detrimental to his planned campaigns, France also faced some significant logistical limitations. Years of war, shifting political alliances, unstable finances, and a slave revolt on Saint-Domingue left France with limited means to project power globally in the later war. With only several friendly ports, French fleets had few places to seek shelter once they were out at sea. Furthermore, the vast majority of these locations lacked facilities to undertake major repairs or overhauls. In addition, those ports struggled to maintain adequate stockpiles of naval stores due to disruptions in supply chains and the demands that continued operations placed on their reserves. While these colonial ports were essential for projecting power, maintaining them came at a significant cost as the naval balance of power swung drastically in Britain's favor after 1806. And for the mids, if you want to put this in context, while Corey was looking at the difficulties of supplying these operations at sea, where you control the seas, I'm going to be talking about how difficult it is to defend and maintain these forward operating bases in contested waters. So by 1804, let's see, we'll look at 1804, the French colonial empire had been primarily reduced to Martinique, as we see here, right? Guadeloupe, as well as up to the northwest off the map, you have the besieged garrison of Santo Domingo in the modern-day Dominican Republic, as well as the colony of Cayenne down on South America. And to the east, you have the Mascarenes Islands, Ile de Réunion, Ile de France, and a couple of other smaller islands off by Madagascar. But for this presentation, I'm going to focus only on the Caribbean, particularly the most important island of Martinique. So it's important to understand that, as Corey mentioned earlier, that the Caribbean colonies were a critical cog to the French economy, generating millions of francs in tax revenue for the state. While the loss of Saint-Domingue in 1803 put a damper on Napoleon's colonial ambitions, the remaining colonies of Martinique and Guadeloupe still were valuable. Although much of their tax revenues would be consumed by local expenditures and the local administration in times of war, the commerce generated by these colonies were an important sort of driving force in the French economy, particularly along the seaboard. While each of these colonies possessed a number of commercial ports, the island of Martinique was naturally endowed with one of the greatest harbors in the Caribbean. Not only was the immense bay of Fort-de-France large enough to shelter a massive fleet, it was also a great protection against hurricanes. Nestled within a half circle of mountains that protected ships from the winds, the westward facing harbor also was less prone to storm surges that accompanied said hurricanes. Therefore, Martinique was both an important economic and military asset to France. So, now to set the time period. The United Kingdom's resumption of hostilities in 1803, it's important to understand, caught both France's navy and colonies unprepared for war. Napoleon was not prepared to wage war with England at the time. The French navy was dangerously dispersed with 25 ships of the line and 25 frigates stuck out at sea. Furthermore, many of the French ships that were back in port were in dire need of repairs because they had been doing multiple transportation runs to Saint-Domingue, ferrying troops, and Napoleon's failed effort to control that island. Furthermore, most of the troops for colonial service had been dumped into Saint-Domingue, and of course, infamously, were going to die of yellow fever. Even more so, what people forget is those troops that had actually been dropped off on Guadeloupe and Martinique also suffered from that bout of yellow fever and were drastically reduced. But leaving Martinique in early 1803 with only 1,200 troops to defend it. Over the course of 1804, 4 frigates slipped in, providing another 850 men, but realistically, that only helped shore up the men that were lost from yellow fever beforehand, and was far short of the 4,500 soldiers that were estimated to be required to adequately defend the island from attack. Furthermore, the island's fortifications were in ill repair, as the British, who we just heard about, captured Martinique in 1794, had let maintenance lap on all the fortifications over their 8-year occupation. Capitaine General Louis Thomas Villars-Joyeuse, the governor, reported that while the batteries of Martinique were well placed, they were so decrepit that they could not prevent the enemy ships from following ours to take our commerce ships and burn them even along our coast. So the fortifications are really in poor shape. But as we all know, the Caribbean colonies will play a major role in naval operations in 1805 and 1806. When rumors of British forces gathering on Barbados reached Paris in early 1804, Denis Ducret, the Minister of the Navy, and Napoleon started discussing dispatching an expedition to Martinique in February 1804. While this plan was apparently dropped, this became the germ of the later plan to use the later operations of 1805, as well as a means to provide reinforcements to these Caribbean colonies. So this idea of the 1805 campaign and the colonies is quickly mixed. With the death of the experienced fleet commander at Toulon, Admiral Latouche-Tréville, in mid-August 1804, Napoleon and Ducret shifted their focus from, at this point, so primarily, you had Latouche-Tréville in the Toulon fleet was supposed to be the primary effort to swoop in and seize control of the channel. But with his death, they switched to the port of Brest, where they have a larger fleet, which was then to land troops in about a large number of troops in Ireland. Meanwhile, the other fleets by Admirals Missiessy and Villeneuve were to conduct diversionary operations in the Caribbean and Africa with the respective Rochefort, the Rochefort fleets here, it's a small squadron of 6 ships, and of course the Toulon fleet. With about 3,500 men aboard the Rochefort fleet, Missiessy was supposed to capture the islands of Dominica, retake St. Lucia, and then reinforce garrisons across Martinique and Guadeloupe. The Toulon fleet under Villeneuve would split into 2 divisions upon entering the Atlantic. A smaller one would sail down and capture a little-known island of St. Helena and raid the African coast, while Villeneuve would take the majority of the fleet to start to capture Dutch Suriname and a number of the Dutch islands that had fallen to the British. However, and I'm not going to talk so much of the details of the 1805 campaign, because there's a lot there, but these plans are suspected of being intercepted by British intelligence in October 1804, so Napoleon and Ducret have to draw up new plans but they don't get about it for a couple of months. In the meantime, Britain's blatant violation of Spain's neutrality with an undeclared strike on the Spanish treasure fleet, Napoleon will find himself unexpectedly with a new ally in Spain. Even before the alliance is solidified, eventually in January of 1805, Napoleon and Decrès start drawing up new operational plans that incorporate the Spanish Navy, with the Caribbean once again playing a central role. The December 1804 plans called for the fleets of Rochefort and Toulon to sail out individually to the Caribbean and then return to gather up additional French and Spanish ships and head to the English Channel. Of course, whichever fleet reached the Caribbean first, their plan was to go out and start attacking the various British colonies while they awaited for reinforcements. After a fixed period of time, the fleets would then rally back to Martinique, drop off troops and munitions before heading back to European waters for the grand finale of the invasion of England. The combined fleets of Villeneuve's command would then free 15 French ships and Spanish ships in Ferrol, head to Rochefort, where they would be then joined by 12 more ships from Cadiz. So the whole idea is go out to the Caribbean, drop off troops, sail back once you gather the troops, and attack the English Channel. Of course, this all falls apart, and so I'm not going to get into that part, but I'll talk about what happens in the Caribbean. Missiessy will slip out of Rochefort in January 1805, reaching Martinique the next month. While he failed in his operations to capture Dominica, he did complete his missions of dropping off troops and supplies around the Caribbean, both in Martinique and Santo Domingo, before sailing back to Rochefort unmolested. Viollet-Joyeuse reported that these troops and arms and munitions will put us in the most satisfying military position for a long time, but that he expected Napoleon would continue to send reinforcements by frigate, as there was already a large number of sick people, obliging him to warn you that we need to keep up the system of successive replacements. Furthermore, the island was in desperate need of funds, as British ships had severely harmed Martinique's commerce. Therefore, the tax revenue wasn't coming in, and he was having a hard time to pay for the supplies that were necessary. This financial strain was further amplified with the subsequent arrival of the larger Franco-Spanish fleet under Admirals Villeneuve and Gravina, who had aboard another 5,000 French and Spanish soldiers. While excited to see such a large force in the Caribbean, in fact, he wasn't fully aware that this operation was happening until the fleet showed up, Viollet-Joyeuse was disappointed that they also failed to bring financial resources and other required naval stores, quote, given the destitution of our arsenals. And of course, it's infamous of how poor the Spanish ships were provisioned before coming out and a whole bunch of other problems that will exacerbate this. Of course, beyond failing to achieve any of their more significant objectives in the Caribbean, Villeneuve's expedition even left Martinique in a worse state before their arrival. His quick departure for Europe only permitted him to hastily disembark on Guadeloupe those troops that he had borrowed from the two colonies. So as he sailed down, he gathered troops, the garrisons of Martinique, Guadeloupe, to make an attack on the British colonies to the northwest. He learns of Nelson's arrival. He panics. He loads off he unloads the troops that he had borrowed onto frigates. They dump them on the northern coast of Guadeloupe. Those guys, several hundred of them, are going to die because they have to march across the island without provisions. And of course, infamously, Villeneuve will not offload the 1,300 troops that were supposed to be left there in the Caribbean. Let's see. So, again, after his Villeneuve's departure, Viollet-Joyeuse renewed his request for men, funds, fuses, mortars, all sorts of military equipment to secure his defenses, as yellow fever and dysentery continued to ravage the fresh troops that had been brought, and the Franco-Spanish fleet had completely denuded the island of resources. Again, Martinique is not an island known for producing food. It has to be imported. Naval stores, all of these things have to be imported to this island. And so the second visitation had severely tapped their resources. Once again, we'll see in 1806 that the plans to revitalize the Caribbean colonies will be incorporated in Napoleon's subsequent naval operations. By September 1805, Napoleon and Decrès had drawn up plans for a series of expeditions that would crisscross the Atlantic, where, quote, these bizarre and incalculable cruises will do the greatest harm to the enemy. As part of this, the Brest fleet was to divide No, that was Villeneuve. That's attack on Saint-Denis. So the Brest fleet was to divide into two separate squadrons. Les Séguiers on the right was to take 5 ships, 2 frigates, and a corvette, and transport 1,000 troops and much-needed provisions to the besieged town of Santo Domingo, and then raid British commerce before sailing back to France. Meanwhile, Contre-Amiral Jean-Baptiste Villemose on the left would lead the other half of the fleet with 6 ships and 2 frigates on a cruise in the South Atlantic, then the Caribbean on a commerce raiding expedition. As Napoleon dealt with the defeated Austria, the Brest fleet finally sailed out on 13 December 1805. 36 hours out to sea, the fleet separated into their 2 divisions as planned. So I'll kind of talk about them separately. So Villemose on the left, after achieving very little success, split up his ships and hoping to increase the chances of intercepting British commerce, assigning Martinique again as their final ultimate rallying point. Over the month of June 1806, these ships then straggled into the port of Fort-de-France. Villemose, of course, really expressed his wishes to return to sea at once. However, his squadron had, quote, urgent needs of all kinds. With the stores on Martinique precariously depleted, it was upon the actual people of Martinique to donate their own food supplies to actually get this fleet back out to sea, which it does at the end of June. However, the visitation of now this is the 3rd squadron to visit the island of Martinique in such a short time period, had put an additional strain on Martinique's finances, where, by the way, the taxes were already 600,000 colonial livres in arrears. They're needing now, at this point, importation of cold hard cash to keep the island afloat. So this was a very heavy expenditure, and of course, Napoleon is only able to get sporadic payments of funds over from France. And of course, meanwhile, Les Séguiers' fleet is infamously caught after dropping off troops on Santo Domingo by a British squadron under the command of Duckworth. And in the battle, we saw the destruction or capture of all 5 of his ships of the line, 1,500 sailors killed, and another 1,800 prisoners. Sorry. At this point, unwilling to risk ships of the line in the Caribbean, Napoleon will turn to his frigates and smaller vessels to reinforce his colonies. Already emphasizing the use of frigates in January 1806, he'll issue clear guidance in August 1806, asking for plans to reinforce Martinique without employing ships of the line, but only those said corvettes, frigates, corvettes, and brigs. While this decision mitigated any risk to his precious ships of the line, it put heavy pressure on the various smaller craft that were scattered around the French Empire. Between 1806 and 1808, Napoleon directed more than 50 frigates, brigs, and corvettes, either individually or in small squadrons, to his Caribbean colonies. Their success, however, depended primarily on the luck of avoiding any British cruises. In addition, or in total, the British would capture 7 of those frigates, while another 4 frigates were wrecked or scuttled. The smaller ships also suffered dramatic losses with the capture of 18 brigs and corvettes, with 3 more being burnt by their crews. As part of these smaller actions, around 300 French sailors were killed, and another 4,100 ended up as prisoners. Due to the strengthening blockade of the colonies, only 60% of all ships ever reached their destination. Or an alternative. Sometimes they were blocked, and instead of going to Guadeloupe, they had to go to Martinique. But at 60% only made it to a French colony. Half of those ships only managed to make it back to France. Right? So we're talking about only 30% of the French ships that Napoleon sent out ever made it back safely to port. Extensive losses. Furthermore, the naval stores on Martinique were completely exhausted already, as I mentioned, by the visitation of these large fleets. Viollet-Joyeuse complained in 1808 that the deficiency was so striking that, quote, if one of these ships is damaged, I'll be obliged to disarm it completely. I cannot repair it. Having not a morsel of proper wood to make a mast or a yard. I mean, that's how poor the island is at this time. Despite all of these efforts, right, all of these ships being sent out, they were only able to raise Martinique's garrison to 2,700 men on the eve of the British invasion. So all of these men and material had been spent to barely keep the island to about half the strength necessary. The difficulty of resupplying the Caribbean colonies, of course, was primarily due to the growing British naval presence. and basically the British Windward Squadron by 1807 is risen to about 5 ships, 8 frigates, 6 corvettes, which allowed them to maintain a more robust presence off the coast of these islands. Mounting pressure from the British Navy also succeeded in capturing the few smaller vessels that Viollet-Joyeuse had at his disposal to maintain communications with the other French colonies. Furthermore, their presence severely limited maritime commerce. With a few American ships coming in to deliver foodstuffs, the American ships were no longer purchasing French materials because they were worried about being intercepted by the British and having their cargoes confiscated. So again, you have to imagine that's a severe drain of cash, right? It's money going out, no money coming in. And of course, day to day, there was growing worries, of course, by the colonial planters who were concerned about making a living. By the beginning of 1808, the British Navy was able to execute a permanent blockade of Martinique. With only 4 months of wheat and salted meat stockpiled, Viollet-Joyeuse ordered the inhabitants to not plant any more sugar, but now we're going to have to plant foodstuffs, right? This is an act of desperation. Of course, Martinique would not be the initial target as the British set their sights on some smaller islands. But again, by this point, the writing is on the wall that these islands are in danger of falling, and it's readily evident that the British are about to prepare for a massive invasion. With news of the British preparing said expedition, Napoleon drew up plans to relieve his colonies. Just before leaving Paris to lead the second invasion of Spain in late October 1808, he ordered 2 expeditions to the Caribbean. Oh, sorry, that was the... All right. So 2 expeditions. From the port of Lorient, you had a squadron of 3 ships, 5 frigates, 2 of them disarmed and converted to transports, loaded with provisions and about 900 more soldiers. Down here at Rochefort, you had another, oh, there's Rochefort there. You had another squadron of 3 ships and an old 54-gun ship converted to a transport, loaded with another 1,000 men and provisions. Unfortunately for the French, that neither expedition could get out to sea due to the presence of a large blockade force off of each port. So Napoleon decides to also order the Brest fleet to send 9 ships and 4 frigates to embark 3,000 troops and provisions as much as possible to go. So he has 3 expeditions ready to go to the Caribbean, and none of them can quite leave. Now, all of this is happening unbeknownst to Napoleon that his efforts are going to be too late. The British had amassed an invasion force of 12,000 troops in Barbados by December 1808, and on January 30th, 1809, they landed and quickly forced and overwhelmed the French garrison, now reduced to about 2,300 men. 400 men were in hospital sick. So again, this is the problem of conducting operations, even when you own the islands, that yellow fever is always prevalent. And after a few weeks of bombardment, Viollet-Joyeuse and his remaining garrison have to surrender on February 24th. Now, back to France, of course. So this is happening unbeknownst to Napoleon. With reinforcements continually blocked, Napoleon sought to use his larger operational plan of sending all of his fleets to the Mediterranean, right? So at this point, Napoleon has built up a large fleet in Antwerp. He has the Brest fleet. And he also has rebuilt the Toulon fleet. And his whole plan, of course, is for the Brest fleet to sail out, gather up these forces, head out to the Caribbean to drop off reinforcements, and then sail back to Toulon and therefore have this large naval presence in the Mediterranean. And not to go into all the details of this, but basically everything goes wrong. You have Villeneuve sails out. He comes off to the port of Lorient. Unfortunately, the tides are not ready, and so the fleet is unable to sail. So he decides, well, guess what? You guys can get out whenever you can. I'm going to keep heading to Rochefort. Meanwhile, 3 frigates get out, and following orders, they try and trail Villeneuve to catch up with him, run into a larger British squadron off of the Sable d'Olonne. And basically, they put up a staunch defense. The 3 ships are ruined, and they're out of action. Meanwhile, you have the remaining ships will actually slip out to port and make it to the Caribbean and drop off troops, and I'll talk about them. And of course, Villeneuve will get stuck in Rochefort. Now, the guy who gets out will make his way, drop off some troops at Guadeloupe once he learns that Martinique has fallen. But he too is forced to basically leave 2 of the frigates on Guadeloupe. He tries to flee back to France with his 3 ships of the line. The slowest one, the de Haute-Pole, he's going to have to abandon. They're being chased. He basically says, good luck, and the 2 remaining ships make their way back safely to France. So again, a loss of another ship as well as the men on board. Meanwhile, the 2 frigates that had been left behind are going to try and make their way back to France individually, and both of them will be captured as well. And of course, this is a high price to pay because as those who know naval history, this ends poorly for the Rochefort fleet, stuck, unable to escape. Provisioning's a problem. The fleet at Rochefort is infamously short on men and provisions. They don't sail. VMOs decides to wait. Too late. The British fleet shows up. They're blockaded. And they try and defend themselves in the poorly defended roadstead of Ile-d'Aix. Fire ships are sent in. The whole fleet is mostly lost, losing 4 French ships and the frigate destroyed, and many others suffering damage. But this was all a high price to pay because it turned out to be for naught. The British invaded Guadeloupe with 6,000 men in January 1810, and the island falls in about a week. So, what is the end story? While these colonies provided Napoleon with the ability to project power into the Caribbean, maintaining them came at an incredible cost. While Martinique served as a base of operations for these multiple naval campaigns, these visits greatly strained its poorly supplied arsenals. Efforts to resupply the colonies after 1805 struggled in face of the growing British naval strength. So added together, the cost of trying to maintain Martinique forced Napoleon to lose 11 ships of the line, 19 frigates, 21 corvettes and brigs. Furthermore, it cost him a precious 2,100 sailors killed in battle and 7,600 men captured, right? So if you put it in perspective, we're almost to the scale, not quite, but we're getting close to the scale of the Battle of Trafalgar in terms of cost of manpower and ships, just stretched over a multi-year period. As Napoleon struggled to reconstitute France's navy, these represented a significant drain of man and materiel. Yet at the same time, the loss of the colonies meant that Napoleon's frigates for later operations, 1810 and onwards, had very few safe harbors or safe shelters. Ultimately, Napoleon's plans for major fleet operations, as he envisioned in 1813 and 1814, would have been severely constrained, relegated to the confines of the Mediterranean and North Atlantic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Wilson is our commentator for this afternoon. Sir, all yours.
Thank you. I need to sit here, is that right? You guys want to, well, I guess I'll talk and you can come up. Okay. First of all, thank you to the 1805 Club for sponsoring the panel. John, as always, pleasure.
It's ours.
Continued support. You've heard a number of papers on the challenges of operating at a distance. I'm not going to recap them. I'll try to keep my comments brief. We've got a limited amount of time here. But obviously, these are generally stories of failure. All the reasons for the failure we've just heard. But when we talk about stories of failure, it seems to me that we can ask a lot of different questions about them historically, but maybe I could suggest 3 questions that we could be thinking about from these stories. So one would be a sort of, why did the failures happen? That's obviously one thing. The second would be, what was the point of the expedition to begin with? So was the sort of cost-benefit analysis of this, why were we doing this that caused the failure? And then 3 was, what alternatives were available to the men and women at the time? So I'm going to sort of ask those questions of our panelists in a couple different ways. Jakob, I hope you can hear me, but I was hoping, Jakob, to get you to address the question about sort of the what's the point question. What was I didn't get a clear sense from your paper, and I was hoping you could say a little bit more about what the vision was for the Danish squadron to actually accomplish on the coast of Morocco. Was the idea actually to put a permanent Danish presence in Morocco? And if that was the point, was that feasible? I mean, just a sort of a macro question here is could they actually have pulled this off, even if the ship hadn't caught fire and all the other reasons that you illuminate that all went wrong? And then Before I get to Corey and Kenny, since your papers work so well together in the West Indies, I thought I would just insert a comment before we get there about what strikes me about the stories of the British and the French in the West Indies is, first of all, the declining strategic value of the West Indies over time. That's sort of been the background of all this. That the amount of money that both sides are drawing from the West Indies is not growing over time, it's declining over time. Some of that's going to depend on the abolition of the slave trade and things like that, as we'll get into. But the other thing that strikes me from a sort of strategic perspective is the ways in which it's declining more faster for Britain than it is for France. And so the value of the West Indies for the British is relatively lower sooner than it is for the French. And so the ways in which the two sides are thinking about the strategic value of the islands is a dynamic process that's evolving over the course of the wars. And certainly after the abolition of the slave trade that also changes the math on how valuable these colonies are. So that sort of struck me as something that's in the background of both of your papers about sort of what's the point of all this. And so that got me then to Corey's paper, and I was recently reading the Navy Records Society volume on the siege and capture of Havana in 1762. And in that volume, there's a document not from 1762, but from 1800, actually, in which Sir David Dundas, who's becomes the commander-in-chief of the army briefly, writes a memo in 1800 saying, if we ever have to go back to Havana, here are the things that we need to think about. So here's all that, because he was there in 1762. And he sort of wrote from his experience about what they were doing in Havana that worked, what didn't work, what were the challenges, how lucky were they to capture it in 1762. And it struck me that this whole idea that the British are experiencing teething problems in 1763 is doubly ridiculous. I mean, it's all ridiculous for all the reasons you pointed out, but it's also like, this is not the first experience that the British have in the West Indies. And the fact that you think that they know what they're doing in 1793, and they don't, and then they still don't learn from it, something else must be happening here, I think. So why on earth can't they learn how to operate in the West Indies, given that they've got centuries of experience doing it, and they still can't quite get it right? So I'd like you to say a little bit more about that. And then finally, Kenny, you do a nice job at the end of your paper talking about the cost-benefit analysis, basically saying this is a whole other Trafalgar. It doesn't seem like it was worth it. But maybe then, could you put yourself in Napoleon's shoes after Trafalgar and tell me what alternatives you think were available to him to use these frigates, these fleets, these squadrons, to consider the value of the islands? Whether that involves keeping the islands is a question that I would like you to address. Right. So what was available to him? And that brings me back to that original question about the sort of declining strategic value of the islands over time. If that's not true for the French, then that would shape his decision-making after Trafalgar. So anyways, those are my comments. Thanks, everybody, and I look forward to hearing what they have to say. You guys want to come here? Janko, maybe you should go first.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Well, thanks for the question. What was the point is always a good question. Basically the point was, yes, to establish a trading station in Morocco, which the Danish government and the trading society at the time thought was feasible, because they had been led to that assumption from their negotiations with this Moroccan in Copenhagen, and the first expedition down there had been successful, but they didn't have the they hadn't secured the local cooperation which could have made it happen. And instead they overreached and said, well, we can claim toll from other ships calling on this port, and that sort of led to the Moroccans sort of running away from the deal, and it all goes wrong with the kidnapping. Otherwise, it would have been feasible, but with the naval engagement, it turned out to be problematic because the Moroccans had a heavy military presence in the port city of Safi. There were tens of thousands of soldiers, and so they would sort of demonstrate the Danish boats would go close to shore and measure the depth, and they did establish that it was possible to sail close to the shore and bombard. But on the other hand, while they were doing this, they could see tens of thousands of troops on parade on shore. So they could see this probably wasn't going to work out very well. So that's why they negotiated the deal instead with the ransom. But it just shows that military force only works if it's backed up by a political element that sort of can. They needed the support from good diplomats, and the diplomacy in this case didn't work. So I guess that's the answer.
All right, I'm up. So I want to tackle the second part of it first, because I think you can probably. I want to do. Why can't they do it right?
Yeah.
Right. This is the question. So you have all this experience allegedly, and you think you know how to restructure, and they take a lot of time and effort to restructure and get rid of debt and things on some of these boards, and they want to do it right. I think the problem is they keep putting the wrong people in the positions to make the decisions. Right. That's what strikes me the most. Is there, it's a new board, but it's the same people or the same type of person that is at the head. And if you, from the top down, this is where the communication needs to come from. This is where the logistics, this is where you determine your pricing for not only the goods, but the transportation, retrofitting East and West Indiamen to be able to carry the goods. If you don't have people that understand what needs to go into those, or especially like for the Vittling board and the sick and hurt board in particular, because that's really what's sustaining these crews. You can transport it there, but if you're not able to feed them properly and get the nutrients, you don't have a lot of that understanding at that point. But you have no medical people on the sick and hurt board, but yet they're making medical decisions about large numbers of seamen and troops being sent to a very well-established and well-known region of the globe where people get sick and they die. And you have no medical know-how to do it. And I think that's really at the root of the problem. Why don't things get better? You can restructure all the time, but truly, I don't think things are going to get better until much later when you put people in those positions that actually comprehend what's going on, understand the network of getting and timber, and being able to understand the process like the Woolwich at the arsenal to how long things take. And so I think that's really why they can't do it right, is because they keep putting the wrong people in those positions.
It's in terms of economic value declining. I mean, for France, they're desperate for funds, so whatever economic value is there is important. People put a lot on Josephine and the family connection. That's really not much. But that's why I highlighted it's Martinique as a military asset with its port, right? I mean, because that allows some combinations that he can have fleets move and do things across the ocean. Once Martinique falls, that's all gone, right? And then you basically are tied to the Mediterranean or close to the channel, which is dangerous because that's close to the British projection of power. The other thing is Napoleon's an eternal optimist, right? I mean, this is something people don't think about, but if you look at Napoleon, the way he operates, he's invading Spain in 1808. He's planning on the Spanish Navy to work for him, and he's planning for Spanish troops to go out on expeditions with his fleet out of Cadiz while he's invading the country, right? He expects to be treated as a liberator and to come in and run the country, and he's planning these operations where Spanish troops will go on in French vessels to go out and reinforce. So, when you keep that in mind, you can understand why he's doing this. And the other part is all these losses are, if you look at a longitudinal study, is early on, the frigates mostly get through. It's as the British blockade picks up, that number of it's more of like 90% of ships are captured in the later years. It was the one, overall it's 60%, but so that's why you don't really realize what you sunk in until the end.
Thanks.
I was just visualizing Napoleon playing with himself the game of Risk. Okay, I really, really do. I want to thank you all so very much, and I'm sure you agree with me that they're excellent papers. And before we go, I'm sorry, questions. I was looking at the time.
No question.
A quick question. Sorry, to what extent do you think it is that this challenge of supplying the West Indies is also a factor of mercantilist interests competing with where they're actually getting most of the supplies from, which is the United States?
Right.
Or, and as that becomes a problem as we get into sort of the next war, but there are strong interests saying, no, we shouldn't be getting stuff from the United States. The United States is the fastest and easiest place to get these things from. No, we should be trying to get them from British Canada, or we should be getting them from India or whatever. And it's just this clash of interests that is also a roadblock to be able to supply the fleet and the colonies properly.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, you're absolutely right. The easiest place for them to get supplies is the United States, but they don't want to deal with them, and the merchants will. But then by the time you're, even if there's a merchant trade system where the goods are going back to Europe, and then somebody's purchasing them and selling them back to the Admiralty, and they're getting shipped back, there's a premium on that. And they're trying to be as cost effective as possible in what they're doing. And in their minds, I think oftentimes that's even though it's the most obvious and probably the most cost effective in the end, they'd rather go the long way around and deal with it because they just don't, and especially because they do get a lot from the Spanish. I think until Spain jumps into the war, they're able to procure from Central and South America. So there are items they can get, but when you're getting supplies, especially the Irish, supplies of the men in the supplies, the easier explanation or the easier place for them to go is to stay on the continent. And so when they do have supplies that are dedicated, they're saying, okay, these are all going to be part of this West Indies thing. They get rerouted, and then you're competing with the merchant network because the supplies that were earmarked for the West Indies, now that they're having to go buy them from like private contractors and merchants in order to supplement what was meant to go there and back. So it gets very convoluted. I mean, it's incredibly ridiculous to some degree to not buy things from North America and definitely from there. But
I just had a really quick question, which I could probably Wikipedia, but I'm going to ask it anyway. And that is that I know that by the beginning of the 20th century, Martinique is once again a French. Well, it ends up being a French department. So when do the French get Martinique back?
1815. Well, part of it is because the British islands don't necessarily want competition either, right? So I mean, this is the interesting thing: is you have British Strategic Command wants to get the French islands, but the British colonists don't want additional competition in their network, so they actually don't want England to keep them. But yeah, short answer.
Any other questions, comments? Oh, Catherine.
It's a comment. My grandfather's great-grandmother was from Martinique. She was a free mulatto named Mariette Vermont. And in 2010, her son was born of an Englishman named Bent, who was a commissioner. Presumably, a commissioner means supplying goods and services to the British troops there.
yeah,
Just FYI.
It's nice to have such a good connection in the audience, right?
We have a question
We have a
online?
question online, yes, from Michael Lynn Waringa. It
I'm
says,
going to
Mr.
that
Johnson,
thing.
you
I'll see you
spoke
there.
of 3 French vessels being destroyed by their crew. Do we know what factors led them to do this? Was British superiority enough?
Oh yeah, so usually what happened was they were dropping off troops, whether it's Guadeloupe or Martinique, but sometimes caught in an undefended port, go to Saint-Pierre or one of these commercial ports. And so rather than having the British come in and cut them out and capture them, they would drop off the troops on the island and then just burn the ship. But it was a last ditch, last ditch thing. It wasn't something planned.
Anything else?
Yes.
I have one last question for Ken.
Okay.
That Rochefort blockade, was that one of the first and only examples of fire ships actually succeeding?
I don't know if it's the only one, but it's one of the most
One of
infamous
the few,
ones, right?
right?
But there's all sorts of plans. There was a chlorine gas attack was also planned at a certain point. Again, the British had this plan for a chlorine gas attack, and the French had plans for sending in boats with like undersea divers. So when you start going into these battle plans, there's crazy things that you start finding. They couldn't pull them off with the technology at the time. But literally, it'd be the equivalent of SEALs today, like holding on to a small commercial boat, sails into the British harbor, and these under 20,000 leagues under the sea diving guys would like go over to British vessels and like drill holes. I shit you not, they like drill holes in the British ships or put mines. And so, but I mean, yeah, there's a lot of fanciful ideas, but the fire ships, this is one of them. And part of it is the roadstead is horribly undefended. Later on, if anyone's familiar with French TV, Fort Boyard is built there. Napoleon is going to put a lot of money. But there's not enough shore batteries to protect the fleet. Going up the river is pretty risky because it's shallow. And that's actually where a lot of ships get damaged as they run aground.
Wow, fantastic. With that, I do have something for you all.
Goody.
Oh, Jakob, I'll be sending you your certificate in the post, and I believe you might have received the honorarium by now. I hope you have. If not, let me know. But Corey, if you have an opportunity, on behalf of the president of the 1805 Club, Admiral Sir Jonathan Bann, I'd like to present you with a certificate of appreciation together with an honorarium.
Oh, thank you, 1805 Club.
The 1805 Club provides a $300 honorarium to each one of our panelists. And again, well done.
Drinks on me later.
Ready?
Yes, you go.
That's
Oh, that's good. Yep.
Out of the way.
Yeah. Oh, now we get to see you. Got it.
Can I move?
Kenny, you're up. Kenny,
I
Again,
thought we were going to do a photo together, but
well, we will.
Here, let me get out of the way,
Oh,
please.
sure.
Yes.
Yeah,